Sam, here to start the end of year content with my reading stats for 2023. So stay tuned for that. Let me start off by saying that if you're not interested in stats, that's fine. I will be doing videos about my bests and worsts later on. But this is just going to be by the numbers. I am the daughter of an accountant and an engineer, and the granddaughter of another engineer. So I love the numbers. I love the graphs. I just grew up with kind of an innate love of that stuff. So that's what we're going to do today. I am cheating a little. So by the end of this year, I will have read 40 books. I've read 38. I am reading 2 now. There's no reason to believe I won't finish the 2 that I'm reading. Obviously, if I don't, I will post some kind of amendment video to change this up. But I am factoring in the 2 books that I am reading into these numbers, except for the star rating numbers, which obviously I don't know yet what the star ratings are going to be for the 2 books I haven't finished. So those numbers, we'll talk about it when we get there, but those numbers do not include the 2 books that I have not finished yet. But let's start with the basics. I read 40 books, or will have read 40 books, that totaled 12,777 pages, which averages 319 pages per book, which sounds about right for me. I tend to avoid really long books if possible. 400 pages for me is is the point where I start to go, I don't know if I'm invested enough to read something this long. The longest book I read was Moonflower Murders, which was 597 pages, at least the copy I had is. And the runner-up was Surrender, which is that memoir by Bono, which was 560 pages long. The shortest book I read was Brokeback Mountain, which honestly is really more like a short story, but the library copy was, bound as a book. It was only 55 pages long. The runner-up for that would be Cemetery Nights, which is a book of poetry by Stephen Dobbins that I reread pretty regularly, and I picked up and reread it again this year. It's a great fall read if you're looking for fall poetry. Cemetery Nights is one of my favorites. If you see me looking off to one side, it's because my notes are on the screen right here. So let's talk about by year, publishing year. I read 12 books that were published this year, 2023. That's 30% of my reading came from the current year. That's exactly the same as last year, by the way, 2022. I read 30% of books published. Well, I read 30% of the books published in 2022 because that would be way more books than I could read in a year. We're talking like thousands, hundreds of thousands of books being published a year now because of like self-publishing on top of Anyway, sorry. 30% of the books I read last year had been published in 2022. 30% of the books I read this year were published this year. 5 books I read this year were published in 2022. That's 12.5% of the books I read. 3 books were published in 2021. 7 books were published in 2020. 7 books were published between 2011 and 2019. And then I read 1 book published between 2000 and 2010, which means that for all of my reading, 87.5% of it came from the 2000s. That's a big chunk. But still, not as big as last year. 12.5% of my reading came pre-2000s. Last year, only 7% of my reading was pre-2000s. So I actually did better reading older-ish stuff this year. I read 2 books from 1990 to 99, 1 book from 80 to 89, 1 book from 70 to 79, and one book from 1950 to 1959. The oldest book I read was Cat Among the Pigeons, which was published in 1957. I just did that book review. You can go watch it. But I read no books published in the 1960s and nothing earlier than the 1950s. So I'm trying to fix that by putting on next year's bingo board pre-1900s, though that is a little bit loose because it will either be a book published pre-1900s or set pre-1900s. I'm being a little fluid with how it counts, but my goal is to try and read more older books, at least one or two older books next year. So I read 40 books, but only but one of those books had two authors. That was The Sun and the Star. So I read 41 authors total. 16 of those were male, which is 40.5%. 24 of them were female, which was 57.1%. And then one non-binary author, which in such a small sample means that like 2.4% of my reading was non-binary. Now, keep in mind that this is my understanding or what I can glean about these authors. You'll see on the graph I've made a little note that some authors are not, forthcoming about their identities, and that's fine. I totally understand that. And therefore most of what I use to categorize is based on the information on the book flap, about the author. I look for the pronouns being used. I look up an author online, look at their website or whatever to see if I can find any information if I'm not sure, but I certainly don't go around hounding, and so some of this is guesswork sometimes, so I could be wrong about some of these identities. But I did knowingly read 14 diverse authors this year, which is 34% of my reading. That's way worse than last year. Last year I read 23 diverse authors. 53% of my reading last year was by minority authors of some kind. And when I say diverse, I mean either ethnically or they're LGBTQ, or they have something that makes them, that sets them apart from what's considered typical. So, the goal is to read about 50% diverse at least. I fell short this year. We'll see if I can do better next year. Last year I didn't break down my star ratings. This year I went ahead just out of curiosity to see so far. Now, so again, this is the 38 books I've finished. And then I will do book review videos for the last two books when I finish those, and we will see where those ratings fall. But of the books I've finished, 3 have had 5 stars. That is 8%-ish of completed books, the 38. 11 books ranked between 4.5 and 4.9 stars. That's a lot for me. That's 29%. I must have had a really good reading year, because I don't think I normally have ratings this high. 6 books ranked between 4 and 4.4, which is 16% of my reading. 9 books were between 3.5 and 3.9, which is 24% of my reading. 5 books were between 3 and 3.4, which is 13%. 3 books were 2.5 to 2.9. That's another 8%. I had no books between 2 and 2.4 stars. That was like a dead zone for me. And then I did have one book, if you see my spoiler alert video, that ranked at between, it was 1.5 star, but 1.5 to 1.9, which makes, it counts as like 3% of my reading, again, because it's such a small sample size. But overall, it was a good reading year. Most of my reading was between 4.5 to 4.9 stars, and that's pretty good. Maybe I'm getting either more generous with my ratings, or maybe I'm just getting better at picking things that I'm going to enjoy reading. It could go either way. Let's talk genres. So the genre I read the most of this year, surprisingly, was fantasy. Now, when I do genres I keep a spreadsheet. When I do genres in my spreadsheet, I put every kind of genre. So like the books I read are multiple genres usually. It's a fantasy, romance, or a mystery, LGBTQ, like there could be multiple. So I don't typically read fantasy, like high fantasy or anything that is primarily fantasy, but I do read a lot of books that have fantasy elements, and therefore in my spreadsheet I mark them as fantasy because they have some kind of fantastical element. A lot of this too will be the manga, because most of the manga I read have some kind of fantastical element to them. So 14 fantasy books, but not really fantasy books. 14 books that had fantasy elements, but that was my largest genre. It was 35% of my reading had some kind of fantasy element to it. LGBT, 13 books had LGBTQIA plus elements. That was 32.5%. It's better than last year. Last year, somehow, I only read 5 LGBTQ books, with 12% of my reading. So I definitely stepped it up there. But last year, I only read 4 books that had fantasy elements. That was only 9% of my reading last year. Also, I did much better with mystery. Last year I only read 1 mystery book. It was 2% of my reading. This year, 7 mysteries. 17.5% of my reading was mysteries. And I'm so glad to be back to reading mysteries. I'm looking forward to finishing, or catching up with, I should say, the Thursday Murder Club books. I've read the first 2 this year. One of them was one of my 5-star reads, and I'm looking forward to reading the 2 remaining ones. I'm sure another one will be out next year. I'm going to be playing catch up, but in any case, so yeah, I read 6 manga this year, which was a bit less than last year. Last year I read 10, but it was 15% of my reading this year were manga, and last year it was 23%, almost a quarter of my reading was manga last year. And then historical fiction, I tend to read a lot of things that have some kind of historical fiction element. 9 books I read this year were historical fiction, which was 22.5% of my reading. Last year I only read 8. Well, no, it's almost the same amount. So about 19% of my reading last year was historical fiction. So I've been pretty steady with that. Last year I read more romance too. This year it didn't even make my list. I think I read 7 books that had romance in them this year. I don't know. I didn't write it down, but it didn't play as big a part this year as it did last year, I don't think. I read 31 fiction books, which was 77.5% of my reading, and 9 nonfiction books, which is 22.5% of my reading. So slightly more fiction this year than last year. Last year, 72% of my reading was fiction, which is funny because I read 31 fiction books last year, same as this year, but I read more books last year, so it counted for less percentage-wise. Last year I read 12 nonfiction books, so you can see I read basically 3 more books total. I read 43 books last year, I guess, which was 28% of my reading last year. So I'm kind of the same, more or less, fiction versus nonfiction. I tend to be pretty consistent with that. I didn't have the numbers for last year's breakdown as far as age groups go. I know I read a lot more YA last year. This year I only read 3 YA books and 3 middle grade books, which was really surprising to me when I looked at the numbers. I really thought I had read more than that. Last year I read so many YA books and a couple of new adult books and stuff. This year, though, only 7.5% of my reading was YA, 7.5% of my reading was middle grade, 85% of my reading, 34 books, was adult. I guess that's just what I've been in the mood for, or what I keep finding maybe. I know I keep going to my library and kind of looking around at the YA shelves and not seeing a whole lot that grabs me, so maybe it's just me. Maybe the stuff that's coming out for YA isn't my thing. I don't know. But I read, finally we'll go on to format. I read 20 hardback books. 50% of my reading was hardback. Almost all of these will have been from the library. I don't think I own that many hardback books. 18 of the books I read, 45% of my reading was paperback. And I read 2 ebooks early on in the year. And then my ebook reader, okay, so I have a Paperwhite. And it's fine, but it doesn't hold a charge for very long. And I can't be bothered to plug it in or remember to plug it in. And I just find I don't reach for an e-reader when I want to read. I reach for a book. I will bring a book with me places. I will carry a book around. I'm just, I guess, that old. So I don't really miss ebook reading. I'm just sad because a lot of the books I wanted to read this year, I think, are ebooks, or would be easiest to get as ebooks. Not all books exist in physical form, and it's expensive to buy physical books. The library doesn't have every title that you want to read, especially if you want to read more independent authors, which I didn't do the numbers for how many independent authors I read this year. I know 2 or 3 of the books I read were self-published. I'm trying to do better about reading self-published authors, independent authors, supporting them. But again, you're not going to find that stuff in the libraries. I don't go to half-price books terribly often. There are one kind of, used bookstore, and they're just far enough away that I don't make that trip regularly. So, it's tricky. I need to find one of those mail order things, I guess, Book Outlet or something. If you know of a good one, let me know in the comments. But in any case, yeah, I don't see myself really doing ebooks much in the future. I guess if something's really, really good, if I'm really keen, I might plug in the Paperwhite and actually charge it up and try and read it. But yeah, I don't use it that often, and it doesn't make it worth getting a new one or anything. I mean, this one works fine if I just charge it and keep it charged, but I don't know. But anyway, those are the numbers for this year. Those are the stats. Let me know your thoughts, what you've been reading. I know Goodreads just sent me an email today saying, oh, your year in books is coming up, so I will share that stuff too when they send it to me. But again, they may not have, I would think they would have to at least wait until the end of the year to give me my full stats. I'm just jumping the gun a little here because I got impatient and I wanted to play with the numbers. Because I like them, they're fun. So next year, hoping to read more diverse authors again, maybe try and read a little more YA, try to read a few older books than I did this year. And yeah, stay tuned for best and worsts and the DNF list. And that's all I'm planning right now, but we'll see. And then there'll be some viewing stuff. I finally watched Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem, so we can talk about that in my next viewing wrap up. We'll talk about how Fargo's going, and what else? I feel like there's something else I watched recently that I was going to talk about, but whatever. Until next time, until I'm able to collect my thoughts and be coherent again, take care.